The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious. The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast episode number 35. And this is one of our slightly different episodes. One of the things that comes up quite frequently in the independence debate is that if Scotland became independent, the UK would lose its power to affect change around the world. And therefore, by implication, a small independent Scotland would not have the ability to affect much change at all. What isn't discussed so often is what kind of change, to what end, and how would it be done? When it does come up in public, it's very often dressed up in the language of humanitarian intervention, which is always assumed to be a good thing. Pure and simple, it's a good thing. So I'd like to present to you this little talk by Noam Chomsky, which is from about 3 weeks ago, in which he talks about the history and the practicality of humanitarian intervention. I think it's very far away from the normal public discourse, and it should give you some ideas. Principally, he speaks about the United States. However, the UK, as one of the client states which he mentioned, is central to the discussion as well. Much of what applies when he's talking about Clinton and the like could also be applied by Blair, who used exactly the same rhetoric, and by extension, the current Westminster regime. So I'll let you hear what Chomsky had to say. Hope you enjoy it.
The past of humanitarian intervention, the history is not very glorious. The future, that actually depends on us. The concept itself is that the phrase has become fashionable quite recently, but the concept is very old. In fact, just about every act of violence and aggression in history falls under the category of humanitarian intervention, at least if we believe the voices of the perpetrators. And that shows up. There is scholarship, academic scholarship on the topic, and it shows up very clearly there. So, for example, one of the main scholarly books dealing with the humanitarian intervention in modern period by Sean Murphy finds 3 examples of humanitarian intervention in the period before the Second World War. The first was Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. The second was Hitler's takeover of the Sudetenland. And the third was Japan's conquest of Manchuria and North China. Now, of course, he didn't mean that these were real humanitarian interventions, but he meant that they were the standard kind. They were claimed to be humanitarian interventions. So Mussolini invaded Ethiopia to uplift and Christianize and civilize the backward people of the country. Actually, the same phrases that President McKinley used when he invaded the Philippines earlier in the century, uplift and Christianize them. He uplifted a couple 100,000 of them all the way to heaven, and the Philippines have yet to recover from the humanitarian gesture. Mussolini's invasion was horrendous and atrocious. Hitler took over the Sudetenland in order to, for the noblest of purposes, to end ethnic cleansing, to allow the conglomerate of people there to live in peace under the framework of the superior technology and culture of German civilization. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria and North China, their goal was to create an earthly paradise and to protect the poor people of the region from the Chinese bandits who were trying to undermine this noble project, at least those of them who survived the slaughter, a huge, monstrous slaughter. And that's pretty typical. The early history of humanitarian intervention is quite similar. actually one of the earliest modern cases, and one of particular interest to us happens to be right here. In 1629, the King of England gave a charter for the Bay Area colony of the Bay Area, and the goal of the settlement was to save the natives here from their fate, bitter pagan fate. The goal was, the principal end of this plantation, the king said, was to civilize and Christianize them. And if you look up on the internet, you can find the Great Seal of the Bay Colony of Massachusetts, that's us. It depicts an Indian with holding two spears pointed down in a sign of peace, and there's a scroll coming out of his mouth which says, "Come over and help us." So the colonists who came were just responding to this plea from the benighted natives to please come over and help them. Well, a strange thing happened. It was actually discussed later years. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, in the two centuries later, in the 1820s, expressed his surprise at what happened. He said that the wisdom of providence, which is inscrutable to mere mortals, caused the natives to disappear like the withered leaves of autumn, even though the colonists had constantly respected them. It's just one of those mysteries. We can't understand the Lord's wisdom and depth. Actually, the perpetrators knew much better. So Revolutionary War hero General Henry Knox, he was the first Secretary of War in the newly liberated colonies. He described what they were doing. What they're doing, he said, is the utter extirpation of all the Indians in the most populous parts of the Union by means more destructive to the Indian natives than the conduct of the conquerors of Mexico and Peru. And he warned that a future historian may mark the causes of this destruction of the human race in sable colors. It hasn't happened. Shortly after Joseph Story's musings on providence, another one of the perpetrators, the architects of the extirpation, John Quincy Adams, lamented the fate of what he called that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. Among the heinous sins of this nation, for which I believe God will one day bring it to judgment. Earthly judgment awaits, and these are not the staples of taught history, they're only the staples of actual history. On the contrary, what we constantly hear is odes to our unique magnificence called American exceptionalism, also not unique to the United States, but very striking right now. The later history of humanitarian intervention is not very different. After World War II, there are actually a few cases of military intervention that had very benign outcomes. Actually, there are two in the post-World War II period, both in the 1970s. In 1971, India invaded East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and terminated a monstrous slaughter of millions of people by the Pakistani army. At the end of the decade, 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and put an end to Pol Pot's atrocities, drove out the Khmer Rouge, just at the moment when they were peaking. But these two examples don't enter the canon of humanitarian intervention because they had a problem. The problem is wrong agency. It's only humanitarian intervention when we do it. We are our clients. And there was another problem with these two cases. The U.S. bitterly opposed them and moved very quickly to punish those who had carried out the crime of ending these slaughters and atrocities. In the case of India, That was Kissinger, Nixon at the time. Kissinger particularly was outraged by this. It was threatening to undermine a secret trip he was planning to Pakistan. He'd already set up all the photo ops and so on. It looked like this might undermine it. We know from recent White House tapes that were released that Kissinger was so furious, he was proposing to Nixon that they use nuclear weapons to stop it. What he said is that if we don't use nuclear weapons, the Russians will attack China and we'll be finished. That's the great diplomat, Henry Kissinger. Nixon was a little more restrained. He thought that mass famine in India would be enough of a punishment for this crime. And Kissinger went on to mock those who, as he put it, who bleed for the slaughtered Bengalis, the millions of them. Who cares about them? Well, fortunately, Nixon prevailed. There was no Armageddon, although the United States did send an aircraft carrier into the Sea of Bengal to warn the Indians of the punishment that they deserve for the crime of one of the two crimes of intervention that actually had major benign consequences. The other was 1979. Vietnam was bitterly condemned for the crime of ending Pol Pot's atrocities. The New York Times denounced them as the Prussians of Asia. The United States imposed harsh sanctions and, in fact, supported an immediate Chinese invasion to punish the criminals who ended the Pol Pot crimes, and the United States immediately turned to supporting the Khmer Rouge on the borders and their attacks against Cambodia, diplomatic and military support. So those two cases can't qualify as humanitarian intervention. If you look on, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the concept of humanitarian intervention became very popular, and there was a good reason for it. Prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, every U.S. intervention could be justified as defense against the Russians. Didn't matter how ludicrous the pretense was, you could always claim defense against the Russians. So you didn't need any other pretexts. But with the Russians gone, some new pretext was needed to carry out the same policies, which of course was done. So humanitarian intervention was called upon. The 1990s were a very interesting period of American history and, in fact, general intellectual history. There has never been a period, to my knowledge, of such effusive praise for the magnificence of any state on the part of the most respected intellectuals, respected figures. So to give you a couple of examples, from the highest, most respected people, the United States was an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity everywhere. Its foreign policy entered a noble phase with a saintly glow. That's Clinton. For the first time in history, a state has arisen that is dedicated to principles and values. That's Václav Havel, acting from altruism alone and moral fervor, hence free to use force where its leaders believe it to be just, supported by the enlightened states who are its respectful allies. That's a small sample of a deluge, again, from the most respected and honored liberal voices, while all through the years the crimes and atrocities mounted. I don't have time to run through them. Well, there was a jewel in the crown, which the final triumph of this noble phase and saintly glow, that was the bombing of Serbia in 1999, the Kosovo intervention. There was an enormous chorus of self-congratulation. There was an international commission led by Judge Goldstone, Goldstone Commission of South Africa, which of distinguished lawyers, concluded that the bombing was illegal, but it was legitimate. And that phrase, illegal but legitimate, has haunted us since. Why was it legitimate? Because it was undertaken to stop an ongoing atrocities. There are a couple of problems with that story, which is uniform. It's repeated today constantly.